Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, today's readings are Leviticus 22 and Matthew chapter 14. In Leviticus 22, we look at the priests and how they eat the sacrifice after the deed is done. Now, there was a provision that the leftover sacrifice could be had for breakfast, lunch, and supper by the priest and his family. But God says to them, only if you're living holy lives, because this is still part of the sacrifice. This is still being given by the people to the Lord. But the most important verse, I think, in this chapter is verse 22, which says, do not offer to the Lord the blind, the injured, or the maimed, or anything with warts or festering or running sores. In other words, if you've got an animal that's about to kill over and die, don't offer that. Don't offer the second-hand thing. I mean, if you were invited to a wedding, you wouldn't get some of your old clothes, wrap them in the present, and go and put that on the wedding table as your gift to the bride and groom, would you? No, you wouldn't. And God is saying, give your best to me. I hope that challenges you like it challenges me. I get up early in the morning and I endeavor to give God the best of my time, the best of my energy, the best of my finance, because He's worthy of it, because He's worthy of our very, very best. But let's go to Matthew 14 now, which is where John the Baptizer is beheaded and his head is put on a platter in a very public banquet that Herod is presiding over. You see, he had challenged Herod's marriage to his brother's wife, and neither Herod nor his wife were very happy with that, and John was beheaded, which poses a lot of questions for you and me. You might be saying, well, how the earth does God allow Herod to get away with that? Well, if you read later in the narrative, he doesn't let him get away with it. Herod dies a very untimely death. But it still poses the question, how does God allow these things to happen to us? Well, one day when we were in eternity, we could ask Him. But one way that I look at these things is I try to look at it through an eternal lens. That we're all just a couple of decades away from our own demise. However that be, whether it be peaceful in our sleep or whether it be a tragedy like this. I was visiting a relative the other day in an old age home, and as I drove in, it suddenly occurred to me, I am legally allowed to buy a unit here now because of my age. And then I thought, hang on a minute, in a short 20 years' time, I'm going to look like this relative of mine. Our lives are just like on earth here, are just like a blip in the timeline of eternity. And so when we see a thing like this, I suppose it doesn't give huge comfort, but it does give some perspective to know that in eternity, we spend that with God, with Jesus, and all righteousness is fulfilled and worked out in the end of things. But Jesus, like you and I was distressed, and so He withdraws by boat. He's mourning, He's grieving. And when He lands, it says in verse 14, there was a large crowd there, and He had compassion on them, and He healed their sick. Amazing. In the midst of His grieving, He still has compassion for people. Why? Because He sees things with an eternal lens. He feeds the 5,000 with this lunchbox of, a couple of fish and some loaves of bread. And I suppose when I read that story, there's so much in there. You could spend all morning going through, God, teach me out of this particular story. But the obvious thing that comes to mind is God makes something out of nothing. He takes that little lunchbox and He feeds 5,000. He took the stone in David's hand and He slayed Goliath. He took the little wooden stick in Moses' hand and He opened to see, what's He put in your hand? What is the gift He's given you? What is the anointing that He's put in your life? You give that to Him and He can do amazing things with it. Anyway, what happens is He dismisses the crowd. The disciples get on a boat. Jesus goes up a mountain to pray. In the middle of the night, there's a storm, and Jesus walks across the water to them. Now, this is a bit of an optical illusion, but it looks like I'm walking on the water to you, isn't it? Now, if that were the case, which is absolutely not possible for me, it'd be quite freaky. And these disciples were terrified. And so Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. Jesus walking on the storm that was terrifying them. Jesus walks on the storm that terrifies you. And Peter says, Lord, if it's you, say to me, come. And Jesus says to him, come. Then Peter got out of the boat, he walked on the water, and he came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and he began to sink. Peter gets a lot of bad press for this, saying, oh, Peter, you stupid. You shouldn't have been looking at the waves. You should be looking at Jesus, because that's the principle behind the story, isn't it? We look at Jesus, not at the waves, not at the things that are terrifying us. But at least he got out of the boat. And there's much more to the story, which I'll let you read. But I think the big challenge for me is that God says, come on, get out of the boat. You say, God, it's COVID. It's like my job's in danger. Get out of the boat. God says, come to me. If your eyes are on Jesus, no matter what the storm is, he walks over those storms. Get out of the boat. He's calling you to him. He's saying, keep your eyes on me. In this world where you can't predict things and where you don't know what's around the corner, one thing is certain. He is able to and does walk on the storms that terrify you. And he calls you to himself, saying he's called you to live a supernatural life with your eyes pinned on him, doing great things for him.